Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today we're looking at another Unified Minds deck. This time it's going to be centered around the new Aerodactyl GX. People are quite hyped on this card. He has good typing, a pesky ability, and a couple reasonable attacks. So let's jump into the basic concept. And really it's thanks to the Pokemon Research Lab Stadium that we really look at Aerodactyl in a new light, because we're able to cheat these into play a lot easier now via that stadium. Go ahead and grab 2 Aerodactyls out of your deck turn 1, slap them onto the bench and start getting ready to power them up on the following turns. That's the concept of this deck. We're just going to try and use Dedenne and Jirachi to get into that stadium on turn 1. So then we can get these Aerodactyls cheated out and just try and use them throughout the rest of the game to help carry us. It has a really annoying ability. It's essentially the Gumi's ability, but now it's on like a bit of a beat stick. So we're trying to stay in the active for the majority of the game with this Aerodactyl. Obviously, we're just attacking with it in general, and gonna hope that that slows down opponents and makes them pass into us sometimes by not having enough energies in play to actually hit into us at all. We're gonna try and use the fire support with Aerodactyl just because I think the fire support is mandatory for energy acceleration. We require Welder to really get into our attacks with Aerodactyl. And also having the Ninetales in here is going to be really nice for gusting out our opponent's stuff. Aerodactyl, being a fighting type, can quite easily tackle the Dedenne GXs and try and punish the opponent for putting those into play. And let me tell you, many decks require Dedenne these days. They are playing high Cherish Ball counts and Dedenne to get themselves rolling, so they oftentimes hit the field. And Aerodactyl is one of the better cards in our format for just easily taking up those prizes and gusting Dedenne to the active and just knocking it out in one hit. That can really be a nice way to sort of tempo out on our opponent, and one of the key reasons why Aerodactyl might be a reasonable deck going forwards. So let's look at the Pokemon lines. We do have 4 of this new Aerodactyl GX. 210 hit point, stage 1. Either we use it via the stadium, or we have a couple unidentified fossils in here as well to get him into play. And of course, Ditto Prism Star does work with this guy. But he has the ability Winds of the Atom. I imagine this will be changing. But while this is your active, your opponent's basic Pokemon needs 1 extra colorless energy to attack. So literally reads the same as Gumi, the sticky membrane or whatever it was called. And yeah, this ability is really strong. Now things need to have, an extra Malamar in play to even be powering up attacks, or have to pass for a turn and do another manual attachment. It's hard for Pikarom to get rolling, and we have weakness on them, so that will definitely be a matchup we like to face. Even things like Reshizard with Welder, they can Welder attach, and then they have to just hit you with Outrage for 30. They can't even go for their Double Blaze GX attack. It's always that extra attachment that buys us, hopefully, fingers crossed, extra turns in the game to help us really just put pressure on the opponent, get initial attacks onto stuff, and set them up for knockouts. And when stuff does get knocked out, it's much harder for your opponent to reload their attackers, because once again, it's an extra attachment for them to get a response into you at all. So that's pretty much the whole deal around this Aerodactyl. He's a very pesky card to get around. Boulder Crush is his main attack for a fighting and 2 colorless. It does 120. This output, I really wish it was 130, to be honest. We do have Diancie to push us to 140 total. But even 140, thanks to the resistance, it means you can't one-hit Giratinas, and you can't one-hit the new Aegislash either. So it's a really annoying number. I wish this had 10 more damage on it. Then I would definitely be much more convinced that it's a very strong card. Again, 120 is not great. You need the Diancie in play to even be 2-hit KOing tag team Pokemon a lot of the time, the ones of 270 hit points. So we really do lean into this Diancie a lot. We definitely require the Princess's Cheers to improve this output, because 120 vanilla is just not quite good enough in this format. But bear in mind, it's, as I mentioned, easily good enough to deal with Dedennes thanks to their weakness and all that good stuff. And it does still knock out a good amount of basics that are trying to evolve and all that stuff. So it's still reasonable output overall. Then we have the Wild Dive GX attack. For a single fighting, you do 50 times the amount of energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So very strong GX attack. Has great synergy alongside his own ability. So a lot of the time, the Wild Dive GX is once again reaching a big one-hit KO. So this GX attack is one of the main reasons, again, why the Aerodactyl is so strong. We're putting on pressure with Boulder Crush. If the opponent does commit a bunch of energies to get a one-hit KO on you, you can always then just look to Wild Dive into it with your next Aerodactyl without needing a Welder or anything like that. You just manually attach a fighting and you can smack them, which is awesome. So the rest of the cards, Pokemon-wise, are basically here just to support them. Diancie, I've mentioned, for damage buffing. The Ditto can evolve into either this Aerodactyl, which is great, or also acts as a second Vulpix for our 9 Temptations Ninetales. One of the best benefits of being able to use a Welder engine is that we can have the Ninetales as a gusting option. So this is fantastic to have in the deck. And from there, just a couple Dedenne and 4 Jirachis. We love starting Jirachi. We have pretty reasonable odds of doing so. And yeah, Stellar Wishing towards Stadium is really important, and other shenanigans throughout the entire game. We're going to Stellar Wish between turns and all that good stuff. And then the Dedenne change, similar story really. If you don't have means of finding Stadium, you can maybe Cherish Ball or Pokecom into Dedenne change for a fresh 6 and hope that that gets you into a better state of affairs. So still a nice option in here for sure. Onto the trainers, lots of 2-ofs I've found in this deck, but when you have Jirachi and stuff like that, you can try and pull these out at the right moments. That's the intention at least. Double reset stamp I think is really important when you're not necessarily a one-hit KO deck. Sometimes you have to settle for 2 shots, but having the stamps in here means that your opponent may have to still struggle to find extra attachments to hit into you and whatnot, so sometimes a 2-hit KO, the slower approach can work out if your opponent's being stamped to a low size. You'll play the double switch and the 3 escape board, ready to supplement this Jirachi. We want to Stellar Wish as much as possible on those opening turns to guarantee the Research Lab, because your win rate is pretty much all in on hitting that Research Lab on turn 1. Double Energy Spinner, we're playing 2 different types of energies in the deck, and because Jirachi can search this, it's a really good way to access our fighting energies, which is otherwise a bit of an issue. Obviously, if we go second, we get immense value, because you can guarantee yourself that like Welder synergy as well as the fighting energy on top of that, which is amazing. 2 Fiery Flints on top of the spinners, although they are not quite as versatile, they're still great for thinning the deck out and gets us lots of fire energy. And they also have a crucial element, which is discard synergy. We want to discard the excess Research Labs and a few other cards that become pretty dead, like excess Jirachis and whatnot. So having these 2 Fiery Flints can help bin off some cards that we don't necessarily need in the like mid game. 2 Fire Crystal for reloading fire energies, mainly for Ninetales to like spam its ability when you need it to, but also great for like reloading an Aerodactyl with a following up Welder. A couple Unidentified Fossil. It's a little bit risky to only have 2 of these and 1 Ditto. It really does mean that we are all in on the Research Lab, but I still believe that's the strongest way to go. Still having 2 Fossils and Ditto means that like technically you could never Research Lab and still get through the game manually evolving up these Aerodactyls, but usually we want to lab on turn 1 or turn 2. Turn 2, even then, is a little bit slow, but sometimes you have to settle for that. A double Cherish Ball. The Research Lab normally gets the Aerodactyls out for us, so we don't have a very high count of the Cherishes, but it's nice for grabbing Dedenne, and of course we can Jirachi into the Cherish Ball to try and get that. For Pokecom, it's always important to put your Aerodactyls back into your deck if they end up in your hand for some reason, off of like a Dedenne change or off of a Cynthia. If you can com them back in, then they're live targets for Research Lab, which is always great. And it's going to give us accessibility into, you know, once again, Dedenne in those early turns to dig deeper, try and find Jirachis, and obviously search towards our Ninetales when we want to have Gust and all that good stuff. The 4 Research Lab really is like the cornerstone stadium of the deck. You've got to max this out because even though it's useless every turn other than turn 1, you just have to find it on turn 1. You really, really do. So that's what we really look for. And then 1 Heat Factory is going to give us some supplementary draw. It's another nice thing you can put into any fire deck just because, you know, it's a good consistency card overall. Onto the supporters, we're going to play 1 copy of Brock's Grit. We play a fairly low count of fighting energy cards, so getting those back into the deck after a couple of Aerodactyls have been knocked out is never a bad thing. Also recycling fire energies is always good when you're trying to spam Ninetales. Think about if you're up against something like Shedinja, you might want to Brock's Grip just pure fire energies back into your deck so that you can have additional gusts to get around their Shedinjas themselves. But also this is really important for the 1-1 line of Ninetales. I couldn't really find space for a 2-2 line of Tails, so instead we're going to try and play Brock's Grit and get around it that way around. I think that's a more reasonable spot. 4 copies of Cynthia, just regular shuffle draw is always nice, and the full Welder, again, mandatory to really get attacking with Aerodactyl on turn 2, and also great for just some supplementary draw throughout the game as well. Onto the energies, 5 copies of Fighting is a little bit on the low side, but we do have those 2 energy spinners to try and like even it out, I guess. And we also have those 6 fire energies that we can pull out quite easily with the energy spinners or with the Fiery Flints as well. So Jirachi gives us really good means of finding these in the initial stages, and they're obviously reusable with those crystals as well. So these are really important in the deck to do our gusting options and also for the Welder. So a nice split of energies overall. So pause now if you want to see the list. It'll also be in the description below. But yeah, we'll move on to the tech options. I've had a lot of different sort of thoughts around this archetype because it's not Like, I think there's definitely some good benefits here, but I don't think it's quite perfect just yet. There's definitely more experimentation I need to do with the archetype. I've thought about adding in a thin Salazzle line. My biggest issue with adding in Salazzle, although its ability is fantastic for you, and it does make your Pokecoms a bit more live, because you'll probably buff out the deck to maybe like 18 Pokemon or something like that. Because you want to keep 2 spaces open always for Aerodactyls, and maybe even a 3rd space for Aerodactyl, throughout the entire game, and then you're usually using Jirachi and Dedenne anyway on turn 1. I would much rather have a Ninetales in play than a Salazzle for the most part, so that sort of bench space does get sucked in by the Ninetales instead of Salazzle. So that's the main reason why I kind of cut it after initially having it in many of my lists. So Salazzle may be useful as a draw mechanic, but I don't think I'd ever play more than a 1-1 line, to be honest, because it eats into your spaces, and you don't really have physical board space for Salazzle like every game, which is a thing. I've thought about Girafarig. The Get Lost attack could be really nice for the Malamar matchup in particular, which I think is usually a little bit awkward because of that Giratina. Yes, they have to attach 4 energies, and it's not always easy for them to do that, especially if you're using Ninetales to gust up their Malamars here and there throughout the game as well. You can really slow them down and maybe buy yourself a turn or 2 for free if you go down that approach, but having Get Lost in the deck would definitely make it even more difficult for the opponents. And at the same time, we could have a better time against Mewtwo matchups. This is the bigger reason why I want the Girafarig in here. We don't have many good ways around Altaria GX. If they're going to copy that with a Mew and Mewtwo, the only thing we can do is try and use 9 Temptations to move that Mewtwo out of the way and hit something else. So if you want to have Girafarig for a better time against the Mewtwo deck, as well as slightly Malamar, that could be a nice inclusion. It would also have a small benefit of helping out against Shedinja, but I think already you're pretty reasonable against Shedinja because you have that really annoying ability on Aerodactyl, so the Oranguru can't use resource management every single turn, and that really makes it hard for them to like sprint and dig for whatever they want turn by turn. There's more fighting support you could try and kit the deck out with. The Marshchamp's a pretty cool one for revenge attacking, and it really releases that pressure on finding your stadium a little bit because you get to have one basic tag team that you can just even attach and weld onto him to revenge out of nowhere. Even that's a reasonable option, so that could be a card you want to add in. And again, 100 Blows Impact could then be an attacker that can actually get through Giratina, so that could be something to bear in mind. But at the same time, he's weak to Psychic, so use him very carefully. Baby Buzz is another card that you could try and add in, but I think already we're a fighting type deck that hits 120, so we're not really gaining anything out of him than we would by not playing him, outside of just being like a 1 energy attacker. And from there's the damage buff cards you could think about. Koga's Trap being a card that could help you push damage on, once again, tag teams that you're trying to 2-shot or onto Giratinas and stuff like that you can't quite hit. So I definitely want to try and make wiggle room for Koga's Trap. I think that's one that I quite like. Martial Arts Dojo is like the other alternative, but we're already playing 5 stadium cards, and kitting out the deck with even more seems pretty overkill to me because there'll just be too many spots where they're dead in your hand. So onto the matchup overview. I think the ones that you're slightly concerned about is Reshizard and Beastbox. Reshizard, I'm thinking mainly of like the Greens Reshizard build because they will usually be playing Power Plant to shut you off, and they also have mixed herbs oftentimes in the New Age builds, and that's really bad for a deck that tries to 2-shot. Beastbox also can sometimes play healing, and they have tank ability of Stack Attacker, so you can be kept out of 2-hit KO range, whilst at the same time often they only use 1 energy to attack with. So you're not getting good Wild Dive GX value, so you're pretty much going to be outboxed by them all the time. You're just hoping that them having to attach 2 energies in certain occasions is going to be hard for them, but even then they can play 3 CE, and they can use Beast Raid just on 1 3 CE if they really have to. Whimsicott decks I feel are going to be awkward when you're trying to 2-hit KO and your opponent can undo that damage, essentially by flipping a heads in the right spots. That's going to be pretty bad, and in exchange for you, Keldeo is an interesting one. Obviously, we have no answer to it right now, so I think that's just a hard loss for you, but it could be something to bear in mind. If you want to tech for Keldeo, you can do. Rowlet Eggs, I think, with the amount of healing it has, is really awkward for your 2-hit KO nature. And Aegislash is similar to the Malamar, where they only have resistance on you, so you can't even one-shot them, which is really awkward. Again, there's the hope that, they have to double manually attach and you can buy turns here and there, but I think overall it will be awkward for you. I haven't put the Malamar matchups in as bad matchups. I think they're not ones that you want to see all the time, but I don't think they're necessarily just straight up unfavorable. I'm hoping that the fact that it's 4 energies committed to a Giratina makes life difficult for them, and the fact that you can gust around them. I put Aegislash as worse than the Malamar matchup because Aegislash probably won't ever put down a Dedenne or any other GXs, whereas Malamar has a chance to, well, most times they'll put down Dedenne in my opinion just because they have to set up, and that can be a good catch-up mechanism for you. So on those turns where they're just having to charge up Giratina and pass, you can capitalize on that to the fullest. So I'm hoping Malamar's like more reasonable than Aegislash. That's a much more difficult matchup overall. But yeah, essentially all of the decks that I've put in here are capitalizing on the 2-hit KO nature of this deck. You don't have big burst damage. You're just limited to the 120 per turn until your opponent commits a bunch of energy to one target, which doesn't always happen, which is the biggest like issue with the deck, I guess. And the Keldeo is the other issue. I don't think there's many easy ways for you to beat Quad Keldeo. Fortunately, there are like plenty of other decks that will have answers, so I don't think you necessarily need to worry about the Quad Keldeo unless you think it's going to be a big deck for Worlds. So my closing thoughts really do depend. Like, the win rate of this deck is completely reliant on finding Stadium on turn 1 and Welder on turn 2. Otherwise, like, you're just passing on turn 2 and then it becomes very slow, especially when we, like I said, we don't have that big one-hit KO comeback potential. So you really need to make sure you hit that Stadium, get double Aerodactyl down, and then set yourself up for a Welder on turn 2. Otherwise, it could get really, really chaotic and difficult for you. I think my biggest like hesitancy is his output just isn't that great. So you're really, really hoping that Aerodactyl's ability is the thing that keeps you in the game a lot of times. So again, it's one of these decks where if people are playing enough Power Plant just to answer things like Mewtwo, that spells trouble for Aerodactyl because then his ability isn't working all the time. Your opponent will be able to just stick with their main game plan and just push through you a lot of the time, which is a bit of an issue for Aerodactyl. And the following thing is that one of the reasons why I like playing Aerodactyl is just because you get to play Welder and Ninetales. Like, Ninetales is such a busted card in this format. Trying to find any deck that can supplement it is just a good bonus. So I think that's one of the cool things about this archetype. Overall, I don't think it's like a top tier contender going into Worlds. I think it's a good sort of rogue pick if you're expecting a lot of Pikachu and Zekrom and other tag team decks. But even then, they could be playing like techs of Power Plant just to deal with Mewtwo and stuff, and life gets difficult for Aerodactyls. So I don't think it'll end up being like the most successful deck in the room by any means. I think it's more on the rogue side. But that's just my initial thoughts. I think it might also be best as like a tech card rather than like a full deck as well. So that's another avenue I need to go down to see whether just adding in a couple Aerodactyls could be like the fighting type coverage that you need in certain other decks. So that's my main thoughts on the archetype. Let me know what you think about Aerodactyl. Do you think he's best as his own deck, or could he squeeze into some other builds here and there? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll be back tomorrow with another Unified Minds deck. So yeah, I'll see you then.